Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about the life and times in contemporary Cambodia. Cambodia is one of the fastest developing nations in Southeast Asia. My guest today is Dr. Teri Yamada. Dr. Yamada is the chair of the Asian and Asian American Studies Department. Welcome, Teri, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, let's start this conversation by taking a look at a book that you've edited and compiled. And the book is a series of short fiction stories by contemporary Cambodian authors. I'm showing it to the camera right now. And I had an opportunity to read this book. It's titled Just a Human Being and Other Tales from Contemporary Cambodia. And I found it to be a fascinating work. And it includes a series of morality tales, essentially. And these morality tales are in the book to emphasize the cultural contrast that we see in contemporary Cambodia. First of all, the traditional values of compassion, kindness, generosity, and loyalty, and so on, that those values are juxtaposed against what I refer to as the mean streets of Phnom Penh, the largest city in Cambodia. And the reality on the streets is that the characters in these morality tales come up against a number of incidents of greed and corruption and selfishness and this sort of endless pursuit of wealth and upward mobility. So when you put this together, what was your objective and what did you hope to accomplish in putting this compilation together?
Well, these are award-winning stories that have received prizes for first, second, third place in the New Hacha Literary Association's annual prizes. So, and they date back to about 2002. And so that was the first criteria. These are award-winning stories. There's very few English translations of any kind of Cambodian literature in English. So the intent was to try to present to the wider world the fact that Cambodians are actually writing. They do have a modern literature, although comparatively speaking, it could be underdeveloped. But it's on its way, and this was sort of a first step to promote to the rest of the world, contemporary Cambodian literature.
And as we talk about this contrast between the traditional values of compassion and caring and generosity and so forth, against what is really happening on the streets with this rapid development and this desire to become upwardly mobile and so forth, there is a strong sense of karma in these stories, portrayed in these stories. And most of our audience members know what karma is. It's sort of what goes around comes around type of thing, with a very simplistic explanation of it. But why is karma such an important cultural underpinning in Cambodian society? And how does it play a role in what's going on today?
Well, this is, we can go back, to 200 AD or so with the beginning of what ends up being Cambodian culture, with the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism, and both of them, advocate the importance of karma. So the notion of karma and how you treat other people is incredibly important and deeply embedded in traditional Cambodian culture. So what happens today with this, go, go, go economy, modernize, get rich quick, it sort of causes a conflict between those values about how you treat people, how you treat the environment, and the fact that Cambodia is changing so rapidly that it feels out of control. The environmental situation, climate change, feels out of control. So there's a lack of balance there between traditional values and what's going on in contemporary Cambodia.
And as we talk about the cultural traditions, we need to talk a little bit about Cambodian history for a moment. You mentioned the fact that karma is, I guess, part of Buddhism and the Theravada Buddhism, which exists today. What is Theravada Buddhism and how does it differentiate from other forms of Buddhism?
Well, Buddhism, as you know, tends to be incredibly complex, and it changes as it goes from culture to culture, as the culture changes it. So there are basically two major strands or streams of Buddhism. One is what we're going to call Northern Buddhism. That's Mahayana Buddhism, Buddhism of the Great Vehicle. Goes through the Silk Road, northern route to China, down to Korea, Japan, and also Vietnam. The Southern Buddhism, which we're calling Theravada Buddhism, is maybe an earlier form of Buddhism, maybe a little bit more conservative, and it travels in the southern route, so it would go through Southeast Asia, also through Indonesia.
And so the original history of Cambodia involves great influence from India.
Absolutely. And in fact, some of the earlier areas that are now known as Cambodia, sort of in the northern part by Siem Reap, Battambang, were the earliest sort of sites of this sort of early colony from India called Funan.
And so we start out with Indian influence.
Absolutely.
And then we develop what is essentially the Khmer Empire.
Yes.
And this really reached its zenith in around in the 1100s or so, 11 to 1200. Who is referred to as the founder of the Khmer Empire is Jayavarman II. And this started around 800, and from 800 to about just over 1400 AD. The Khmer Empire was really the dominating influence in that part of the world. Tell us about that.
It was. Well, he's a very interesting sort of god king, which is what they were called, because he changed sort of the religion of the area at that time from its emphasis on Hinduism to that of Buddhism. And of course he began, the area that we now call Angkor Wat, which is the city of temples, which everyone now wants to go see, as they're touring Southeast Asia. And so he started an era of 300 years or so of great urban planning, pretty sophisticated technology in hydrology. It's urban planning, so it was a pretty sophisticated sort of civilization that he established that then had influence in a very large area of Southeast Asia as far as Burma, Malaysia. So very vast reach of Vietnam as well, southern Vietnam. So it had an extensive influence in an area that really didn't have any borders or boundaries yet, like we know as nation states, but very extensive influence in trade, religious influence, customs.
And from what we understand of I guess, geological surveys or anthropological surveys they've done of the area, the city of Angkor, where Angkor Wat is located, may have had as many as 1 million people living in that area.
Exactly. So it was really broad, yes.
And in my travels to Thailand, I went to the ruins of, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, so you'll have to correct me, but Ayutthaya.
Right, Ayutthaya, right.
Ayutthaya. And it was actually the Ayutthaya group which I guess overran Angkor and that other kingdom?
Yes, that's the theory. Of course, we don't know exactly what happened, if it was a one-time event or if it was just a series of events from that new group who had come in from southern China, known as Thai. And they did, as they sacked, what was remaining of the kingdom, apparently take the sacred texts, the palace dancers, which are also really part of the sacred art. And so a lot of Thai culture then seems to be based on Khmer culture.
And of course, the folks from Thailand, or Ayutthaya, which later became known as Siam, they didn't have a free reign forever either, because I believe in the 1700s, the Burmese came in and took care of business and stole a lot of the gold and so on at that time.
So, seems to be a trend.
Exactly. So there was a period between about 1400 and 1860 where there was a series of conflicts between Vietnam and Thailand, which was Siam, over who would control that area known as Cambodia. But then in the 1860s, the French came along. Emperor Louis Napoleon III thought that he needed to play the colonial game and wanted to compete with Britain in particular. So he started his inroads into Indochina, which we know of as Vietnam, particularly because of the conflict in Vietnam in the 1950s when Vietnam broke free. How did the Vietnam War actually set the stage for the Khmer Rouge, which came in and controlled Cambodia for 4 years and established what became later known as the infamous killing fields?
Right. Well, we have to go back to our own U.S. history to sort of understand how this instability actually impacted Cambodia, which would be the secret bombing of Cambodia during the Richard Nixon presidency. So there was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is where the guerrilla warriors were like traveling up and down, oftentimes in tunnels under the ground. So about a third of Cambodia was actually carpet bombed. The third of Cambodia that lies against, where that route was. And over nearly 3 million tons of bombs were dropped on that area, causing a third of the population to flee, largely rural population, so they're fleeing where? Into Phnom Penh, which was the largest city. So it created incredible instability. The government of Cambodia then, falls in a coup in 1970 to Lon Nol. So there's just, it's pretty chaotic. You can't take care of 1 million people when you don't have a really strong infrastructure in one city.
And because of all of the confusion and the chaos and the violence and so on, Pol Pot becomes the leader of the Khmer Rouge, but unfortunately they instituted a lot of very harsh and very severe kinds of policies that affected the population, and that's why they call it the killing fields. Up to as many as 2 million people died during this period. Right. Why did Pol Pot and the other leaders of the Khmer Rouge impose such harsh conditions, and what were those conditions?
Well, I think we have to understand that the Khmer Rouge largely evolved as a rural movement. So they weren't in the big cities. And remember that those were the areas that had been carpet bombed. So there were a lot of angry, displaced young men that he tended to focus on. So we're looking at 10, 11, 12, the child soldier scenario that we see in Africa is a very sort of similar pattern to what happened in Cambodia under the leadership of Pol Pot. Now, I think the leadership will stipulate that they didn't ever intend to establish something that was so awful. How it happened was because there was an emphasis on the importance of rural Cambodians, pure Cambodians, Cambodians who were not impacted negatively by Western culture. Those were called the old people, and they were sort of preserved and maintained with a higher status than the so-called new people out of Phnom Penh and the other larger cities. So when the Khmer Rouge came into Phnom Penh on April 17th, they told everyone they had to leave the city, everyone. Because in the city you had the professionals, you had Khmer speaking French who had been to France, the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers who had negative Western influence.
And it was also cultural sophistication, which
Absolutely.
we would refer to it today. We need to take a
Exactly.
break right now. We'll come back and continue this conversation in a moment. And stay with us. When we come back from the break, we will continue this conversation about the history and the contemporary times in Cambodia. Stay tuned.
International business, huh? Number 1, know the culture of that country. Come alive with Pepsi. Translated into Chinese is, Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the dead. PepsiCo made that mistake in Taiwan. Learn about strategic planning, government policy, and policy analysis, and so much more. You can become a part of this exciting career field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Dr. Teri Yamada. And Teri, before we went to the break, we were talking about the Khmer Rouge, and it's a pretty complicated subject, so we don't want to give it short shrift when we have the opportunity to sort of lay this out so that it's understandable. The Khmer Rouge, as you mentioned, was a rural movement. It involved young men who felt dispossessed, if you will, by their own country.
Exactly.
And there was also another cultural trend that was going on, which was coming from China, the so-called Cultural Revolution, which also had a lot of influence on this. Tie that all together for us, if you would.
Well, I think one thing that should be important for us to understand was that the impact of the Khmer Rouge was not equal around Cambodia. So certain areas of Cambodia would have sort of a secondary leadership, not communicating very well with others, that would be more oppressive and even crueler than other leaders in other areas, which would be kinder even to the so-called city people who had been shoved out of Phnom Penh and were now doing manual labor digging trenches in malarial forests. So, that's many reasons why so many of the so-called new city people died, is because they were working in these outrageous conditions. The Khmer Rouge wanted to take people back to traditional medicine, so they're giving people things that don't work really in curing malaria, or even if you get an infection. So a lot of people died due to starvation, due to disease, and also, of course, brutality, because if you were identified as not being pro-Khmer Rouge, then they would take you out to the forest and club you in the back of the head. And that's why we have the so-called killing fields, which were thousands of people were just piled on top of each other.
And a sad state of circumstances, any way you look at it. I think, as you mentioned, they didn't envision that it would become this tragic when they started this movement, but it did turn that way. Eventually, the killing fields ended after about 4 years, when Vietnam actually came and invaded Cambodia and took over and tried to sort things out. And then in the early 1990s, the UN got involved and actually established or helped establish a constitution and the electoral process.
Right.
So what happened then in the early 90s?
Well, I think that was, at least from my perspective, it was a really great opportunity for Cambodia, because you had UNTAC, United Nations, coming in. They calmed a lot of problems down with the Khmer Rouge, because there was still a civil war going on at that time. And then they were able to facilitate the first democratic election. So there was a sense of things were really going to be changing, that Cambodia now had finally established a government where people were going to try to attempt to work with each other across parties. So during the 90s, if I can just continue, there was a sense of, wow, things are getting better. Phnom Penh, started, improving its conditions. The buildings were all falling apart. Streets were not paved. So the 90s was a really, in my perspective, a hopeful period where things have turned around and we're going to be going forward now. And there was a lot of way to go forward in Cambodia at that time.
So we saw improvement, and we saw the foundation being laid for the economic development that has happened so rapidly over the last 10 to 15 years. In 1997, there was a coup, internal coup, where the co-prime minister became the sole man in charge. His name is Hun Sen. He's been in charge basically ever since. And so we see Cambodia today, which is fast growing, fast developing, lots of economic activity. However, there are some concerns about human rights and civil rights and that sort of thing. And if I may just quote for a moment, Human Rights Watch Southeast Asian Director David Roberts described Cambodia recently, and I quote, "a vaguely communist free market state with a relatively authoritarian coalition ruling over a superficial democracy." Now that's kind of a mouthful, and we might be able to throw in "and a healthy dose of crony capitalism," just for good measure. So what does that mean in terms of that description of the way things are in Cambodia today?
Well, I think one thing that is admitted that we need to recognize is that Cambodia essentially is an international welfare state still. A lot of folks still donate to Cambodia. Japan does, France does, now China, Korea, United States, of course. It has more NGOs than almost any other nation in the world, and it's those non-governmental organizations that raise the rabble about human rights, about the problem with AIDS, HIV and AIDS. So without those non-governmental organizations, there wouldn't be much social service right now in Cambodia, which is, to me, sort of a scary thing. So the government is more concerned than with buildings. Like last year, they approved close to 3,000 new sites for building in Phnom Penh. They just approved two business towers that are going to be the tallest in the world through a Thai construction company. So the government is very much involved in what's going to be making money, sort of in the underground way that wealthy folks in Cambodia are involved in money making, but not ordinary people. Ordinary people can't make money that way.
And also the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index has indicated that Cambodia, in a rating system, rated 99th out of 102 in terms of the most transparent governments where the rule of law is followed. So when you have that kind of a system where the rule of law is not followed as it should be, what can happen in the society?
Well, I think everyone knows that if you want to get something done quickly or maybe well, that you have to bribe the right sort of people. I mean, that's just, everyone knows that. So
corruption, that's where that term corruption that we talked about in the very beginning of the show comes into play.
Yeah.
When we do talk about economic development, what kinds of areas are growing in the economy? Would it be agriculture? Would it be textiles and garments? Would it be tourism? You mentioned Angkor Wat and so on. Are those the areas, and construction, building construction?
Right. I'd like to touch upon agriculture for a minute because there's been a lot of, I think, really positive change for farmers in Cambodia, in the rural areas, especially in the area of Battambang, which is close to Angkor Wat, and jasmine rice. So there's a push to export really high quality jasmine rice. Last year I visited a new rice mill, which was high tech, state of the art, because these little tiny, mills that various farmers or communities have, they still leave little bits of rock in the rice, which is not good for export. So I think that's really positive and is a growing sector that's important. Garment industry, yes, but that's more in the bigger cities where they can establish those large garment factories. Garment industry workers have been very strong and been able to form unions and strike and get an increase in wages that gives them more money per month than ordinary public school teachers. So, they're doing much better. Building construction has gone totally crazy. That's the only way for me to describe it. There's building going on everywhere, and I have no idea where all of those thousands and thousands and thousands of condominiums, I don't know who's going to be buying all of them because they're pretty pricey. The ordinary person in Phnom Penh maybe makes $300, $400 a month. They're not going to be able to afford those really nice condominiums that are coming up everywhere in Phnom Penh and Siem Reap and the capital city of in Battambang.
And from what I understand, tourism is becoming quite popular there too now.
It is, but it's down this year a little bit. I'm not sure why, maybe the sort of chaotic economy that we've been experiencing. But yes, Siem Reap and Angkor Wat it's very beautiful. It's highly developed. There are luxury hotels there, and it's a wonderful place actually to visit. And people are trying to take care of it. And a lot of that is from money from the outside to preserve, the temples of Angkor Wat.
Well, as we talk about the economic development and income levels rising, you mentioned the garment workers being able to use their unity to push for higher wages. According to a World Bank poverty assessment, the poverty rate has come down from about 52%, which is pretty high, down to about 21% over the last dozen years or so, and also household consumption has risen about 40%.
Yes.
So you've got consumption rising 40%, poverty rate going down by more than 30%. Those are good numbers and positive signs, but there's some concern about that.
Yes, and there's also concern about statistics used in Cambodia. So when we talk about statistics, we always have to use some sense of caution about how accurate they actually are. If you travel out into the countryside, which is actually most of Cambodia, you're going to see really, really impoverished people. A lot of them. Often, they don't have wells, they don't have water, they don't have clean water, they may not have electricity, although almost everybody now has a cell phone, right, a smart cell phone. So there's a huge gap now between the rural areas and the urban areas. Now Phnom Penh is booming. There are, Starbucks, brown coffee shops everywhere. There's a lot of extra money that people have to spend in Phnom Penh, and a burgeoning, upper middle class. So, and too many cars, lots of cars. So, traffic it's really congested now, and you can just see it really booming. But it's not like that in the countryside, where the level of education is still extremely low. Many young girls still can't go to school because their parents will keep them home to work in the fields. So that's huge gap. There's a huge gap.
So we may need to look a little more critically at those numbers as they come out, even if it's from the World Bank, because there's a story behind the numbers that maybe isn't fully revealed. What about educational opportunity? You just mentioned that in the rural areas, it's not what it should be. Are we seeing at least some effort to utilize some of that development money to increase the level of educational opportunity, at least in the larger cities?
I don't think that development money is going into building public schools. That was a task taken on by the government, Hun Sen's government. He did build a number of public schools, but you have to have textbooks in those schools, and those textbooks have to be of quality and they have to be up to date with good information. That's not happening very rapidly. So if we go back into the cities, then it's a completely different scenario. You know, since the UNTAC era in 1990s, we've had people who had many Cambodians coming back from the United States or Europe and establishing universities. So there are private universities now in Phnom Penh that are really quite good. So, and public universities as well, they have improved. So overall, you've got a much higher level of education in Phnom Penh and the other big cities. There's a great university in Battambang than you do in the rural area. So once again, you have this really big gap. That doesn't mean it's the best, however. There's still a lot of work to be done in upgrading science, technology, medical conditions in Cambodia are really not good still. Okay.
So it is definitely a work in progress.
Definitely a work in progress.
And with that, we're going to have to bring the program to a close. This has been fascinating. Thank you for being with us here today.
Well, thank you for being interested in Cambodia.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.